I knew when I married him that Don was a good man, but not a smart one. That's partly why I loved him. It's also why he was such a good fit for the Marathon County Sheriff's Department. Kind-hearted, followed orders, too happy obeying to ask questions. Exactly what you want in a cop. I fell in love with Don for a lot of reasons. He always stood up straight, always showered twice a day, ironed every shirt he wore. He was a proud man, and it was those little things he was proud of that I found so adorable. He was gentle too, never raised a hand to anyone unless he absolutely had to. What didn't matter to me was that Don had never been the sharpest knife in the rack. I always knew Don wasn't smart. I didn't think he was stupid. I learned how wrong I was when he came home one night with that statue. When I asked him why on earth he'd bring evidence from a crime scene home in the first place, he told me he didn't know. I was sympathetic at first, not angry, not terrified like I am now. I thought he'd been unable to part with it because of some kind of post-traumatic stress. And like I said, my Don was kind-hearted. Soft was the word my father, who definitely isn't kind-hearted, used. That's another part of what made Don such a good cop in these parts, though. You needed softness when settling violent disputes between drunk couples or picking up strung-out tweakers from the curb all day, especially when every perp knew you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Marathon County ain't the kind of place where nights like the one he found the statue happened. It was a triple homicide. Don had dealt with his share of murders, but never a multiple body count. I saw how rattled he was as soon as he almost fell through the door. I'd been married to him for almost 8 years, dating for 6 before that. High school sweethearts, that old chestnut. In none of those 14 journeys round the sun had I ever seen my man so pale, so shaking, so distraught. You know those photos of World War I soldiers with a 1,000-yard stare? Yeah, if you do, you'd seen the look my Don had on his face that night. He didn't say anything to me the entire evening. He sat down, put the statue on the table, downed a glass of water, and then went to bed. Not one single word in my direction. Didn't even meet my gaze. I didn't find out from Don what had happened, but from his boss, Sheriff Harworst, an old family friend, as most folk around here are. Harworst painted a grim picture over the landline. Don had answered a call about a domestic disturbance from one of the other apartments in that complex. He'd arrived to find the door to the crime scene, apartment 19, hanging from its hinges. You could smell the blood in the hallways, apparently, but did Don stop and call for backup? No, he didn't. Not my Don. Daddy called him soft, but Daddy was an idiot. Don was kind, warm, had no roughness to his edges. And what he didn't lack, though, was balls. That's another reason I loved him. He had, metaphorically speaking, the biggest cojones I'd ever known to a man to swing. A gentle, fearless giant. So yeah, I had no reason to doubt Harworth's recount of Don running into the apartment, firearm raised, ready to save a life, end one, or probably both. Harworth didn't arrive until later, after Don didn't radio back. They sent the whole armed unit. They feared the worst, but what they got was, well, it was worse than any worst folk around here usually imagine. Don hadn't answered because he was curled in the fetal position in one corner on the studio apartment. I'd never seen Don cry. Men around these parts don't, generally speaking. I didn't believe that part of Harworth's story until he described the carnage he found Don amongst. As I said, it was a triple homicide. Don't ask me who done it because they still didn't catch who did. The victims were all male, all tweakers too, most likely given the neighborhood Dawn found them in. Finding 3 bodies would have messed anyone up, and that's the truth. But Dawn was a cop. 3 bodies in and of themselves aren't usually enough to rattle cops, especially ones with a few years under his belt like he had. No, it wasn't finding 3 bodies that rocked my husband worse than I'd ever seen. It's what had been done to them before they died. The sicko who killed them had made some alterations. That's how Harworth described it to me before I'd sworn at him so much he gave up being coy about details. I must admit, I still regret browbeating him into the full truth. He's a good man, and by the time I put down the phone, I realized he hadn't been trying to withhold anything from me as some kind of commentary on the emotional fragility of my gender. He didn't want to talk it out in full because he was scared too. It was impossible to identify the victims for a simple reason. They'd had their faces removed. The killer had stripped back the flesh until nothing but bone and muscle remained. They'd been thorough, too. Tongues, jaws, teeth, eyes, noses. Almost everything that wasn't the skull itself had been carved off. The wounds weren't clean either. They were jagged, ripped. The kind of wounds made slowly and painfully by a blade far too blunt for butchery. Harworth's vivid description of the meatless skulls was in itself enough to buckle my knee so bad I had to sit down. His recollection didn't stop there, though. The faceless corpses had been positioned kneeling in a circle, facing inwards. At its center was a compost heap of scraps of skin, bone, muscle, teeth, hair, eyes, all the offshoots and trimmings left over post-mutilation. Other parts had been removed, too. Every finger and toenail had been pulled out, hamstrings had gouged out, and discarded to keep them immobile. The swollen bruising meant they'd been made when they were alive by Harworth's reckoning. He also reckoned the horizontal gashes across each of their stomachs weren't made post-mortem, either. Disemboweled ain't a word I ever expected to hear in Marathon County, nor on our side of the TV screen, at least. The offcuts and offal of every wound and opening had been added to the mound of gore. I nearly puked when Harworth told me that there was enough of it stacked up to reach his waist. The walls of the studio apartment were caked in blood. Every bit of furniture was smashed, most thrown across the room judging from the dents and holes in the cheap plaster walls. A CD player had been left on, playing Gustav Holst's Mars on repeat, which Harworth sheepishly admitted he had to cross-reference to the track number against the list on the CD case to figure. They'd found Dawn curled in a ball amongst the carnage, sobbing at the incomprehensible violence and destruction around him. Harworth sent him straight back to the station to shower and head home. That's why he was calling, to check in. The sheriff didn't know about the statue. I figured at the time it would be best to keep it that way. Maybe Dawn wasn't the only idiot in this house. We didn't talk about the statue until the next morning. I didn't even register it that first night. My husband had come home traumatized by an event so horrific, I was traumatized just from listening to someone recount the traumatic details. That's 3 levels of trauma I was dealing with. Trauma cubed. Excuse me for caring more about my man's emotional well-being than some trinket he stole. I fell asleep holding Dawn while listening to him sob quietly. It was the first and only time I'd ever been the big spoon. He wasn't in my arms when I awoke. I found him downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the statue. That's when I noticed it properly for the first time. It was placed atop the mound of viscera when Dawn found it. It was made of a material that resembled jade, if jade was the bright orange of magma. It didn't feel like jade to the touch either. Despite looking smooth and polished, it felt rough. Rough doesn't feel like quite the right word, though. charged is more appropriate. Almost like it felt how battery acid tastes. The statue was of two men standing back to back. They were, to put it delicately, huge. They were a level of swollen that nobody could argue was healthy, attractive, or in any way a shape human beings were meant to be. Their stomachs sagged to their knees, ankles folded around feet so tumor-like that the stubby toes poking from beneath them were barely visible. There was no part of them that didn't sag, bulge, or droop, and all of it had been captured in hideously accurate detail by the sculptor. Every pore was visible, every hair, thin wrinkle, and fold of skin plain to see. If the subject matter weren't so unsettling, I'd have said it was one of the best bits of art I'd ever seen. The sculptor hadn't given the orange jade men faces. They had heads, sure, but both were depicted wearing tight bags or sacks that obscured their features. What wasn't obscured were the painfully tight-looking lengths of barbed wire wrapped around the bags. Just looking at it made my face itch, my insides queasy. As I said, Don was staring at it when I found him downstairs. I asked him about it, and he said he didn't know why he picked it up. Shock, he reckoned. He couldn't stop thinking about it last night, he told me. The statue, not the incident. At the time, I figured the statue fixation was some kind of coping mechanism. I know better now. I was gentle the first time I told him to take it back to the station. Reminded him kindly that having it was technically illegal, but given the circumstances, Sheriff Harworst was sure to look the other way. Don agreed to take it back later that day, when he went down to the station to file his report of the previous night's incident now that he was calmer. For the rest of the first week, I genuinely believed that was the last I'd seen of it. And then the weekend came. Don and I had a Friday night date night agreement that was sacrosanct. Had been since high school. I'd given him a fair bit of slack during that first week. He was despondent, withdrawn, distant. Again, I put it down to the drama. That's the exact reason I picked his favorite restaurant, Mac's Steak and Brat Smackdown Buffet, for our meal. To cheer him up, and because he knew that I hate Mac's Steak and Brat Smackdown Buffet with a passion. You can imagine my anger when I was left waiting there like a jilted high school kid for 3 hours. I was willing to look past a lot, but failing to follow Friday night date night tradition wasn't on the list. Don was supposed to meet me straight from work as he did every week. I'm sure you can also imagine how much calling to find that he wasn't even there further stoked my itch. The final nail in my rage coffin was where I eventually did find him. More specifically, what I found him with. He was sitting at his desk in his study. You can probably already guess what I caught him doing. Staring at that statue. Don didn't jump, didn't flinch, didn't even blink when I threw open the door. It took a good 10 minutes of me yelling at him for him to mumble an apology. No amount of berating could conjure an explanation for why he'd not gone into work today or where he'd gone after I heard him leave the house that morning. I gave up digging for a reason why he still had the statue after an hour or two. I felt bad about my outburst. Don had gone through a lot, and when I calmed down, I rationalized that I'd probably been unrealistic in my expectations of how quickly he'd bounce back. I apologized, and he agreed to return the statue and speak to Harworst about some time off. I watched him take it with him in the car the next morning just to be sure. Again, I thought that was the last I'd seen of it. Don was still withdrawn and sullen for the next few weeks, but started to show flashes of his former self here and there. He didn't miss Friday night date night again, that's for certain. I'm not a snoop either, and I always like to give Don his privacy. But I have to admit, I did search his study once or twice when he was at work during that first week, just to make sure he'd actually made good on his promise. By the time the night of the incident was almost a month behind us, I had almost thought we were getting back to normal. That's when I got the second call from Harworst. Don hadn't returned to work since his week of recuperative leave. At first, I argued. I saw him leave the house every morning, I said, uniform and badge ready in his bag. It was when Harworth started mentioning how easy it was to lose said badge that I stopped playing incredulous wife and started listening proper. I didn't ask about the statue, both because I didn't want to get Dawn fired and because I already knew the answer. When Dawn got back from work, I was midway through tearing his study apart. He tried playing dumb at first until I mentioned the call from Harworth. He broke down at that and confessed at least to his lies about his whereabouts. I took what he said then as the truth. I still feel like a fool about that. He told me he'd been in bars drinking, that he couldn't forget about the incident. That's why he was so tired all the time, he told me, so withdrawn, so unfocused. I also bought the lie about him throwing the statue in a river. Well, no, I'm not giving myself enough credit here. I didn't believe him. I just wanted to. So much so that I made the unconscious decision to just leave it. To live in the fantasy land where my brave husband was a recovering alcoholic cop despite never smelling of booze or spending a dime. It only took 2 nights for that fantasy to come crumbling down. I was woken by a crash outside our window. Nothing major, you understand, probably just raccoons or the wind knocking some dead foliage our way. It was realizing that Dawn wasn't lying next to me that got my feet out of bed and treading as quiet as possible around the house. I heard him before I saw him, and because of that, I managed to see him without him seeing me. I don't know what would have happened if he had. I don't think I'd still be alive to tell this, that's for certain. He was standing in the downstairs bathroom facing the mirror. It was the look in his eyes that made tears instantly fall from my own, that clasped my hand to my mouth to stifle a terrified whimper. I'd never seen that look on my Dawn's face. I'd never seen it on anyone's. Evil. It's not a word I ever thought I'd find myself using in seriousness or outside of church. It's the only one I have, though. Dawn never smiled with his teeth. His reflection was grinning so wide I could see all of them, even the molars. His normally narrow eyes were stretched to perfect, bulging circles. Ventricles and veins pulsed on their surface, and his left eyelid twitched without warning in an erratic, arrhythmic pattern. His nostrils were flared almost to the point of being level with his cheekbones, brows raised until it crushed his forehead against his hairline. The muscles and folds of the version of my Dawn in that reflection were stretched back so far that if I couldn't see the back of his head from my perch on the first floor landing, I'd have sworn someone was holding him upright by the back of his head. He was talking to himself, repeating a single word over and over. Perfection. It's a word I'm all too familiar with now. But that night, it raised nothing but terrified confusion. He was dragging his razor across the mirror like he was trying to shave the face on the other side of it. Over and over, he dragged the blades across the glass. The squeaks and scrapes set my teeth on edge and the vertebrae of my spine to shudder. I couldn't stand to watch for more than a few minutes. As I said, the only word I have is evil. It wasn't light that danced in those bulging eyes. It wasn't the happy spark of joy I'd fallen in love with. What twinkled in Dawn's eyes that night was a cold, dead lust, a lifeless urge for things too foul for you or I to comprehend. A small part of me wishes I'd been carrying my phone, that I'd taken a photo. Unless you saw those eyes for yourself, it all probably doesn't make sense. In fact, I kind of hope it doesn't. If it does, and you've seen eyes like Dawn's, and your life is already or about to be as screwed as mine. I couldn't sleep that night. When Dawn eventually came back to bed a few hours later, I just laid trembling in the dark, waiting until his snoring started to burst into stifled sobs. I left a note when he went out the next morning. Told him he needed to sort himself out and that I was going to stay with my sister to clear my head. I couldn't tell him the real reason I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't close my eyes without seeing a version of his face so terrifying it made the thought of being around him induce a panic attack. A week went by and I started to get worried about the fact that he hadn't called. After a while, I started to think that maybe I'd been half asleep when I saw him, or that I dreamt it. I wish that were the case. Once again, my negativity turned inward and I started beating myself up over my overreaction. Don was unwell and I'd abandoned him, I told myself. I was a terrible wife. I'd left him alone when he needed me the most. My sister didn't share the view. She had made me promise not to go back to him groveling, not to make the first move, not to be the one that reaches out to break the ice. I broke that promise on the Saturday morning by phoning Don, and broke it again when I went home upon the call going straight to voicemail. It had been a week since I'd last stood in my living room. Looking at the state of it, Don had abandoned it himself not long after. The whole house was trashed. Every piece of furniture had been pulled apart or thrown across the room, or in some cases taken to with a sledgehammer by the looks of things. There were splatterings of blood here and there, pools of it forming around sharp metal edges and splintered wood where he'd pulled furniture and appliances apart with his bare hands. My tears started silently falling almost the exact moment I crossed the threshold into our once beautiful home. I couldn't allow myself to believe my Don, my gentle, caring Don, was capable of this level of wanton destruction, this carnage. I wouldn't believe it. I had to tiptoe over broken glass, wood, and plaster in almost every room. A thick cloud of dust sprang from wherever my foot fell, and there wasn't a single room that didn't stink of urine, rotting food, or both. He'd done that too, you see. He'd done it on our upturned couch, on the inside of our beaten-in fridge, and in the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. My tears weren't silent as the mental images grew more and more vivid. Each room gave enough new evidence for my imagination to make an ever-clearer montage of Don, with his bulging eyes and tooth-filled grin, ripping apart the life we'd built together in the most destructive, most barbaric way he possibly could. This was not my Don. Couldn't be. But it was. It was his study that broke me. When I found it, I could do nothing but fall to my knees and weep. Unlike the rest of the house, the study was more or less intact. In here, it seemed Don had decided to create rather than destroy. He'd built himself an effigy on his desk, a crude replica of two large, back-to-back figures I recognized immediately. I can't bring myself to say what he made them out of. My Don might be... Well, he might be the reason all this happened, but I care enough for my memory of him that I won't conjure the mental image of him using his bare hands to make a sculpture out of... well, out of the other kind of body waste. I could smell it as soon as I reached the upper floor landing. It wasn't the disgustingness of it that pushed the last of my composure from me, no. It was the mental image of my once proud Don, of the bestial, primal, horrific thing he'd become. It was the thought of the man I admired above all others, broken, wretched, and weak. Despite my terror and anger at our destroyed home, all I wanted to do was help him. I could smell it as soon as I reached the upper floor landing. It wasn't the disgustingness of it that pushed the last of my composure from me. No. I was about to phone the only person I could think of, Harworst, when something on Don's desk made me pause. It was a receipt for a storage unit on the edge of town. I knew the address. A friend of ours kept some of her ex-husband's stuff there after a messy divorce. I should have listened to my gut. It was my gut that told me not to phone Harworst. It was my gut that told me to put my phone away, to go downstairs, to get back in the car. It was my gut that convinced me that I could help Don, that I could get through to him, and that once I found him at the storage unit, we'd reconcile and he'd get better, that all this could be put behind us. If anyone tells you to always trust your gut, don't listen to them. It was easy to find which of the few dozen storage units Don had rented. It was late by the time I arrived, and it was the only one in the lot with a light on. Even if it hadn't been, The weary old man in the booth was more than happy to throw the spare set of keys at me once I explained who I was. That creepy guy with the bulging eyes had come to visit his unit a few days back, and none of the booth attendants had seen him leave. When I questioned why the police hadn't called them already, the man in the booth scratched his chin, looking sheepish. They were scared of him, too scared to phone the cops. Seems ridiculous, right? It wouldn't if you'd seen the face in the mirror that night like I had. To me, the attendant's fear made perfect sense. I asked when Don, first took out rental on the unit. The man told me it had been a few weeks prior, coinciding with the day Don had thrown that statue in the river. Obviously, I wasn't putting the dots together in my head. I'd blinkered myself to a lot that I should have seen coming, but I wasn't foolish enough to still believe that lie. As much as it made my stomach plummet, I knew that when I found Don, the orange jade effigy would be with him. I thanked the wiry attendant before heading in the direction of Don's unit. The man in the booth seemed sympathetic. He let me know gently but firmly that if I wasn't back in an hour, he would phone the police. Said he couldn't rest with my death on his conscience, no matter how scared of that creepy tweaker he was. I didn't argue. Don's unit, Unit 19, was at the very edge of the lot. I couldn't hear anything except for the distant groan of traffic and the faint crinkle of a chain-link fence catching in the wind as I approached. It was a cold night. This wasn't unusual with it being November, but for some reason I became acutely aware of it in the near silence. I could feel, hear, and see my rapid, shallow breaths. I managed to get at least 6 into each footstep, the fog of my lungs' warmth billowing from my lips. The handling to the door of Unit 19 was cold too, much colder than the air. It was the kind of frigid that meant it almost burned to the touch. If my fingers weren't already trembling when they wrapped around it, they would have been by the time I'd finished turning. The units themselves were quite spacious as far as storage units go. Each had 2 rooms, a short hallway where one entered, and accessible via an inner door at the hallway's other end where the storage area was. The storage area had a rolling garage door to allow goods in and out, of course, but this could only be opened from the inside. It was for the inner door that I needed the key. The walk from the outside door to the other end of the hallway was one of the longest of my life, mainly because in here, I could hear Don. He was bawling, not crying, not sobbing, bawling, like a toddler that lost its parents, and not in the at the grocery store way. He was completely unrestrained in a way that I don't think I've ever heard an adult, man or woman, shed tears. It was a sound of pure despair, one that you don't realize you're glad you've never heard of until you do. The emotions that swelled in my chest when I heard it were as strong as they were complex. Sympathy, fear, disgust, care. The need to save and the need to flee started an intense battle within me the moment those sniveling wails hit my eardrums. Don's choking moans made the writing on the walls 100 times more unsettling too, I'll tell you that for nothing. It must have taken him days. The same word across every inch of brick over and over and over. You can probably guess the word already. Perfection. What that word meant to Don, I wouldn't know until the inner door to the storage area creaked open. I had to get there first. Even though the hallway was only about 10 feet in length, this was still a challenge. The cries and retches echoing off of the dark bricks made putting one foot in front of the other a conscious effort. My mind wouldn't let me do anything but fixate on Dawn's reflection in the mirror, those eyes filled with her cold, dead lust. With every foot, the distance between the second door and I shrank. The pictures behind my eyes grew more vivid. Over and over, my sadistic conscience replayed the reel of Dawn smashing our possessions, of him urinating on our wedding album, of him tearing apart our house until his hands bled. Tears streaming down my face. Each one for the proud man I'd never known not to stand fully straight, for the sniveling, hunched creature I feared he'd become. After the key clicked in the lock, and the door to the storage area swung open, I knew straight away that the levels of terror in my anticipation were nowhere near enough. The smell hit me in the face like a sack full of drowned rats. I actually took a step back, gagging and trying to pull my shirt up over my mouth to cover my nostrils. It was the same stench as Dawn had left in the house, but magnified 1,000-fold. There were new layers to it here, though. Layers of mold, of decay, of rotting meat. There was no light on the other side. Light from the grimy bulb in the hallway barely made it half of a foot before the shadows consumed it. The stench wasn't the only thing to assault me from the shadows, though. With it came the flies. There were dozens of them, hundreds. If it hadn't been for Dawn's crying, I'd probably have heard their collective buzzing from the hall. I screamed, violently fanning my arms in front of me to stop any of the fat, black, buzzing lumps from finding their way into my mouth or nostrils. My anticipation was now a full-blown dread. Every artery thrummed from the sheer force of my frightened pulse. Fast, deep gulps oversaturated my brain with oxygen. Black spots started ticking in the corners of my vision. Consciousness threatened to leave. My knees were midway to buckling when a realization slammed a fresh load of adrenaline through my veins. The moment I'd screamed, Dawn had stopped. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I could hear him in the darkness. He was standing somewhere on the other side of the room. His breaths were slow, heavy, and ragged enough to hear even over the horde of insects I'd freed when I opened the door. When he did answer a further 2 times, I found my fingers tightening around my phone. Not to find help, but to find light. My palms were sweating so much that I nearly dropped the thing as I swiped the passcode onto the screen. My trembling index digit missed the button for the flashlight twice before finding it. The real screaming, the screaming that meant my ears were ringing for a solid week after that night, started as soon as I did. The first thing the beam of phone light revealed was the floor. The concrete was caked in both the bodily exertions the stench led me to expect and large patches of dark red crust I recognized but really didn't want to. There were glistening chunks strewn across the floor, chunks of graying brown that wriggled with maggots. Some of the chunks had hair, others fingernails. One had a dead, glassy eye. In the center of the room was that statue. The floor beneath it was clear, immaculate even. Dawn had taken great care to ensure that none of his mess, the destruction left in the wake of the man he'd become, touched it. I would have picked up the darn thing and smashed it right there, but I had another priority. Even though I knew I'd find them here, the 2 orange figures weren't who I came for. Dawn was standing at the other end of the room facing the wall. The light crept up his naked, trembling body. Every inch climbed revealed a fresh wave of dread. My Dawn, who'd showered twice daily and took great pride in his self-maintenance, was caked in every substance spattering the floor. My beautiful Dawn, who'd never let himself slouch even an inch, now hunched over on a bent and crooked spine. My darling Dawn, covered head to toe in deep, pus-filled scratches, burns, and blisters. The full image of the back of his naked body was too much. I yelled something. I forget what. What I said isn't important. What's important is the sound of words coming from my mouth startled me. Startled me so much that I dropped the phone. I was only in the dark for a few seconds. I dropped to my knees to search around in the muck almost before I'd heard the clattering squelch of it hitting the floor. I found it in no time at all, pulling myself to my feet and pointing the light once more in front of me. Straight into a pair of bulging dead eyes and a grin that showed every tooth. Somehow, I didn't repeat my clumsy mistake when I fell over backward. The phone stayed in my hand, the horror-revealing beam of light locked on the monstrous figure that was once my husband. Even hunched and crooked, he towered over me. The look in his eyes let me know what I needed to. That it was over. That it had been the moment he was unlucky enough to be the cop who answered the call to that apartment. I remember begging him to get it over with, for him to kill me and end this nightmare. He didn't say anything back. He just stood there, caked in depravity, grinning down at me with that evil face. I wish I could say that it wasn't Dawn, but it was. Something in me knew that my Dawn, my beautiful Dawn, wasn't trapped by that face. It was his, no less so than the soft little half-smile I fell in love with. He wasn't possessed. He hadn't been taken over or inhabited by some entity. This was him now. This was my Don. This is what he had become, what he always would be. In my mind's eye, I could see him pouncing. I tensed, ready to fight him off as he tried to tear me apart with his bare hands. The moment never came. Twisted as it sounds, part of me still wishes it had. All these years later, what he did instead was far, far worse. With a single fluid motion, Don reached with both hands and grabbed the back of his head. Grinning down at me, left eye twitching, he muttered one single word. Perfection. And then he pulled. My screaming had been caught in my throat while I was down on the floor with the dried blood, urine, and feces. It found its way back out as Don's muscular forearms wrenched his scalp. Even though my lungs were hitting decibels they never had, I could still hear the tearing. It started at his neck, a thin line of scarlet born on the bulge of his throat that flashed up to his jawline within a fraction of a second. The wet, crackling snaps of flesh prizing itself apart. Grew louder the further Don's arms stretched from his skull. His scalp, hair, and face went with them. I retched at the sight of his eyes rolling back in their sockets, vanishing from view as the face around them went limp and sagged. Within a few seconds, he dragged the skin off his head and clean off, sliding it from bone and muscle as easily as removing a hood. Exposed teeth, bulging lidless eyes, gaping open nostrils. None of the nightmare-inducing anatomical horrors I'd expected were waiting for me under this facial skin Don tossed over his shoulder, like a wet paper towel. This next part I know sounds impossible and is the exact reason I've spent the last 5 years in St. Dionysus' home for the incurably mad. This might be the only chance I get to tell my story, though. And I'm not going to leave anything out. Underneath Don's freshly removed face were two heads where one should have been. Two squashed heads that writhed and undulated to separate themselves and inflate to their full size. Two heads wrapped tight in orange plastic bags. Bags kept in place by constricting lengths of rusted barbed wire. I was already running to the door by that point, although my feet found it difficult to find purchase with all the muck all over the floor. More than once, I fell over in those few seconds before I finally found the hall. I got far too many glimpses of those two things clawing their way out of Don's body. Somehow, he didn't buckle until the very end. The two barbed-wired crowned lumps clawed and fought their way from his neck, both against Don's flesh and each other. His chest and torso bulged and stretched as they pulled more of themselves from whatever hell they'd risen from. I heard ribs cracking as one of the orange head twins wrenched an arm free. The back of my neck felt warm wetness as the other one punched through Don's stomach with a gnarled foot. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself from taking one last mortified look over my shoulder before I started running until they found me on the freeway 3 days later with bleeding feet. The two figures from the statue were standing above their likeness. Don was gone. Completely eviscerated. I don't know how and I don't know why, but they'd used him as some kind of portal or opening or gateway. I love to think that wasn't what he wanted, but I still remember that face. His face. I think that was his plan all along. The moment he found that statue, it had its hold on him. I think this was always his endgame. The two men he'd birthed into the world with his madness would have dwarfed him. Each was easily over 7 feet tall and nearly as wide. Even over the stench left by Dawn's activities, I could smell the rancid mucus that covered them, the acid ammonia burning that oozed from them with each of their labored, bag-covered breaths. As I said, I wish I'd never looked back. Now every time I shut my eyes, the first thing I see is that image of them standing there in the blood and fecal matter and urine, of one of them raising their tumorous hand and pointing at me. The next few years are a blur. By the time the waking nightmares started to subside, I'd already been here at St. Dionysus for several years. I'd apparently been pretty difficult, let's say, during my time here. It's taken another few years for them to trust me with a pen. I've bribed one of the orderlies. He's gonna spread my message. Get it out there, put it online. Everyone thinks that I killed Dawn and all those people. I was too out of it to give my side of the story. I need people to know. I need you to know what really happened. I don't want to say what I bribed him with. I don't have much. You can use your imagination. Please. Make it worth it. I need the world to know. Not just because I'm innocent, but because those things, they're still out there. They have been all this time. If they could corrupt someone like my Dawn, make him do... None of you are safe. None of you. I hope the orderly makes good on his end of the bargain. I hope my message gets out. I was going to tell you my name, but there's no point. You don't believe me anyway, do you? I'll know my story's out there, and that's enough. I hope you listen, because one day you might find a statue of 2 back-to-back men that feels like battery acid tastes. You might feel tempted to take that statue, to keep it. Please, even if you don't believe me now, when you find that statue, leave it be. Walk away from it. Pretend you never saw it and live your life. And if you see the 2 men with their bags and barbed wire, well, I'm sorry. But it's probably already too late.
Good evening, everyone. Giggles the Croupier here. Just wanted to thank all of my incredible patrons for supporting me. Tam B, Jen Miser, Skymara Ravenswood, Melissa Perez, Bernard Jackson, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Neon Scoundrel, and William Delphin. I'm still figuring out rewards for Patreon, but if you would still like to support, click the link in the description and I will hopefully have something for you soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.